right, ladies and gentlemen, our last unit. We're going to start off by talking about World War II. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot of military events in World War II. It's a war, after all. But the College Board does not really make it the business of multiple choice questions, especially to ask you about specifically military events, unless they have a big outplay on like the strategy or the civilian side of the war. So I will talk about military events in here, but if you're looking for a really in-depth knowledge of D-Day or Operation Barbarossa from a tactical standpoint, or Sea Lion, you're looking in the wrong place. We're going to talk here a lot about the civilian effect of the war. We're going to talk about the planning at the war conferences. We're going to talk about the beginning of the war and sort of the tide of it, but not really the detailed battles of the war. That's what we're going to be tested on, so that's where we're going to stay. Let's start by talking about the Lebensraum. That's a cool word. The living space, the Lebensraum, that Hitler would like to take. That's the territory in the east. So Hitler would tell you that if you looked at a map of Europe, especially one drawn after the Treaty of Versailles, it's just not fair. Not only is Germany not as big as it could be, because some of the German people weren't living within Germany in a boundary sense. They were in Austria, they were in Czechoslovakia, they were in Poland. But that the German people were too good to only have such a small space. They deserved more. By more, he means Central Europe, he means Eastern Europe, and he also means the territories of the Soviet Union all the way to the Urals. What are we going to do with all that land? Well, we're going to use it for the resources of the land, not just the food, but also the petroleum resources, and we're going to use it for this enormous Aryan population. Hitler's going to starve to death something on the order of 70 to 100 million people in that area and plant the German Reich there so that it may prosper for its 1,000 years. Why would anyone let him do it? Okay, the big word of this unit is appeasement. And early on in our study of this unit, we saw that European leaders, particularly the French and the British, allowed Hitler some space. There's a number of reasons for that appeasement. Number one, a lot of people began to believe that the Treaty of Versailles wasn't exactly well done. Too harsh on the losers and too kind to the victors. And not really consistent. If it is about self-determination, and self-determination is going to explain why we create a new country like Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia, then where's the self-determination for colonial lands held in Africa and Asia? Seems to be a pretty inconsistent policy. Number two, there is a real fear of war here. And we can call the European powers a little bit afraid if we want to, but that really doesn't recognize the fact that World War I was a generation-ending war. Populations of societies completely disappeared. There is no willingness to sort of mount that kind of a charge again. So if Hitler pushes a little, we're going to see the French and the English willing to let him push a little because it means that they don't have to go to war. Reason number three, they really can't go to war yet. Looking at the English and the French military society, it is not nearly as large as it could be. Don't forget, we're in the midst of a depression here. And on the other side of the Atlantic, America is as well. And so there's not this huge amount of resource that we can put to the military yet. Hitler, on the other hand, has been arming himself well. He's not as big as he's going to be. But when we look at the German production, it's been mostly in public works, that is to say roads and railroads, which when it comes time to war, those are very important. But he's also been producing in a military sense. So Hitler's production has been more in line with a war economy than the other nations. And they realize that if they go off to war against him, it's an iffy bargain. Let's throw in some other things. That the map at Versailles wasn't drawn well, that the Germans deserved to have more territory, and that some of the countries that had been created around Germany were unstable, right? These new democracies in Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia that were not able to really fight off the problems of the Depression. Throw in a last one, Hitler might be better than Stalin. If we get a chance to choose between Hitler and Stalin, Stalin's a socialist and Hitler's not. And that might make us pick him over the other one. So what's Hitler going to do? Hitler is going to try and push and push and push. So looking down here, in 1935, Hitler marches the troops into the Rhineland. That's against the Treaty of Versailles, sir. He begins to expand the military over the 100,000. That's against the Treaty of Versailles. And the English and the French appease. Because war is the last alternative, right? There's supposed to be a League of Nations that can stop this. Weak. Can't do anything. There's supposed to be France and Britain. They can't agree on what to do. France would like a weak Germany. Britain needs a strong Germany. Tragedy all around us, okay? The problem really begins then after the Anschluss. The Anschluss is the absorption or the taking of Austria. Hitler moves into that territory. Hitler then begins to take parts of Czechoslovakia. Everyone gathers in Munich in 1938 to talk about whether or not he should be allowed that. And Hitler pulls one of the moments of history where he promises Prime Minister Chamberlain of Great Britain that he will seek no more territory, that this is it, that the aggression shall end. And Chamberlain comes back to Britain, right? And he's got that piece of paper. I have in my hand this paper guaranteeing peace in our time. Yeah, good one. Okay. Within a year, we were at war because we know that Hitler is going to turn the tables or turn his back, however you want to say it. He's going to lie to Chamberlain and eventually take us off to World War II. Okay. In September of 1939, Hitler's going to invade Poland, but before he does so, he's got to cover his bases a little bit, and that's the subject of the August 1939 Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviet Union. The Non-Aggression Pact is in essence a ceasefire. It says Germany will take the western half of Poland, or western third if you like. The Soviets will take the other third, and there'll be this Poland in the middle that will allow to operate. But what it says is we're not going to attack each other. Don't get the idea that this is about you. Now, are the Germans going to attack the Soviets? Yeah, they are. Hitler thinks that's going to happen somewhere around 1944, 1945. And the Soviets know it. And they need to sit there and stockpile, and the Germans need to stockpile, and then there is going to be the haymaker of all haymaker wars between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. But we can't have the war yet. So when Hitler invades Poland in September of 1939, he's covered his bases with the Soviet Union. What he's kind of surprised by is the declaration of war by France and Britain. Poland? You guys drew a line on Poland? You didn't on the Rhineland. You didn't on troop size. You didn't on the Anschluss. You didn't in Czechoslovakia. And now suddenly you all want to go to war over Poland? A country that's only been back on the map for 20 years? Didn't even exist from 1795 until 1919. And now you're going to war for it. Okay, here we go. The war. Okay, on our study guide, moving down here, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Hit them hard, hit them fast, take them out. The Nazi war machine was more ready than other countries to go to war, and so it was able to topple some people very quickly. The Allies in this battle. So let's start off. The British, the French, okay, and that's going to expand eventually to include the United States after 1941, the Soviet Union after the summer of 41, China as well. The Axis, Germany, Italy, and in the Far East, Japan. An axis, okay? Flipping the page. The next question here is about the Jewish issue, okay, and the solution of the Jewish question. And I know that you're thinking, we should be talking battles, Holliday. We'll get there in a moment, but let's talk about the Holocaust here. Hitler had, from the earliest days here, a plan to sort of transport and move the Jewish population. That's part of the immigration phase or the Madagascar phase, where they thought that they might move everyone to the German colonies in Madagascar, which they didn't. When the war begins, Hitler takes aim at the Jewish people through the Einsatzgruppen, the killing squads of individuals who would go into areas in Poland and eventually in the Soviet Union. They would round up the Jews and shoot them one by one. The horrible thing is that by late 1941, Hitler believes that he really can't continue to eliminate the Jews at that kind of a pace. He wants a much more efficient, faster pace, and that's the subject of the Wannsee Conference held in January of 1942, where the final solution is devised, constructed, put under the guise of Heydrich, and as a part of that, then, the Nazis are going to build the death camps and begin to exterminate the Jewish population in a larger way. Now, I want to parlay that into the next section, which is a discussion of World War II on the home front. The Germans are the last country to go to total war, not doing so until well into 1942. Keep in mind, then, that Hitler is really taking on an ambitious run at this war. He is going to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. He has America on his back, basically, from the early days of the war, but in a real military sense, starting in early 1942. And at the same time, he's going to try and put together the Holocaust and run that while all of these other moves are taking place. Obviously, the move to total war is an attempt to make sure that production and efficiency can be kept up. But Hitler's in for real trouble. We talked about total war quite a bit, guys, but here's what you should take away. Two big things. Number one, the tactics are very similar to World War I. Use the women a lot in factories. Okay, rely on people to sacrifice, ration food, get dissent curbed as much as possible, recruit an enormous army. This is going to be a long, bloody war. So you're going to have to conscript as much as you can. We're also going to produce just military goods straight down the road as much as possible. Now, as I said, the Germans are the last to do that because the Germans are afraid that they'll end up with a scenario like World War I, where the civilian population really begins to crumble before the military population does. Okay? The other thing you should keep in mind, point two, that's really important here, is that unlike World War I, civilian populations are going to be really targeted in World War II by long-range aerial bombing. That's something that we don't see in the First World War. We don't have the technology for it, but we've mastered it here. So we are going to blow the living daylights out of each other. Okay, out of Dresden and London and Tokyo, and the civilian casualties, I beg your pardon, are going to be enormous. We're going to see the same kind of thing in the Soviet Union, not really with bombers, but more with sieges. Some of the long, ugly sieges in the history of mankind, millions of people dying of those Soviet cities by the German army before Stalin turns them around. Let's talk about the war conferences, and then we're going to wrap this up. In November of 1943, the Allies get together and meet at Tehran. Stalin, already feeling like he hasn't gotten the sort of love he deserves, wants a second front in the war. So Stalin has been taking the real weight of Hitler up until this point. He wants the Allies to crack open a second front, preferably in France, that will allow the war to be a two-front war for the Nazis. In other words, other people besides the Soviets are going to start doing some of the dying. Stalin's going to lose 27 million people in this war, and he feels like the United States and the British have left him out there a little bit. Remember, Stalin's a pretty paranoid guy, but he's got a fair point here. It is the Soviet citizenry that's doing most of the dying. Now, the Americans are doing most of the spending, so it's a little bit different as to what your contribution to the war is. That second front is promised within 6 months. Unfortunately, it doesn't arrive for 7. Hey, Stalin, how's it going? Finally arrives in June of 1944 with D-Day and the opening of that second front of the war, which then begins Hitler's real demise. From that point on, it is a race to Berlin from both sides to see who's going to be squished in the middle. With that race to Berlin going on, in February of 1945, the Allies sit down at Yalta. And this is the more important conference, because at Yalta, we're going to win. Now it's an issue of what we do afterwards. They agree that Stalin can have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, but he has to hold free elections. Now, that idea right there is kind of hard to put together. A sphere of influence, but free elections. How do you have democracy, but you have a sphere of influence of the Soviet dictatorship there as well? That's already dicey. We're going to have a United Nations. We're going to divide Germany into 4 parts, and the city of Berlin is going to be divided into 4 parts as well. We're going to do everything that we can to sort of denazify the German population and move things down the road. When the war is finally over in Europe, the Allies meet one last time at Potsdam. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, unfortunately, has died, and the new president of the United States is Harry Truman. Truman's going to take a harder line with Stalin than Roosevelt did. Most of that is because Truman believes now we really don't need Stalin as much as we did. The Nazis have been defeated. And while he's at the Potsdam Conference, Truman gets confirmation of an atomic bomb test. He's got the master of all weapons now. Stalin knows he has it as well, but we're not going to talk about it. What are we talking about? We're talking about taking Germany apart. We're talking about trying to win the war in Japan. And we're also trying to make sure that Stalin holds those free elections. That's what Truman's really going to bite at him on. Where's our elections? Where's the freedom for these people? Have we liberated them from Nazism only to put them back under the boot of the Soviet Empire? That doesn't seem fair. And that disagreement between Stalin and Truman is one of the big seeds of the Cold War, the ideological conflict that rages between the United States and the Soviet Union well into the 1980s. We'll pick it up in the next unit. Take care.